Okay, welcome back. The second panel is designed to talk about the experimentation that's underway and the experimentation that might get underway in the relationship between philanthropy and journalism. And I think I'd like to frame the panel around a couple of observations and also try to draw us down to perhaps a more specific and more pragmatic conversation around these issues than we've yet been able to have. That would be one of my goals for this discussion. One of the broader framings, though, that I would offer is just the observation that we are obviously in not just a period of transition, but a period of profound experimentation. That's going to lead us into some cul-de-sacs from which we'll have to back out, and it may lead us forward in ways that nobody quite expects. And so what I want to get at in the relationship between philanthropy and journalism is not the search for a magic cure, but a tour of pragmatic forms of experimentation and where we can see traction and where we can see limits in the experiments that we're already thinking about or participating in or trying to design. And so then the sort of related frame is, I hope that each of you in your introductory remarks and then when we turn to questions will consider and take the audience. This is a sophisticated audience. It certainly includes a lot of sophisticated practitioners. Take us into your confidence to the extent that you can and tell us at the grinding level of year in and year out practical funding and the relationship between funding and content. Where do you see sources of success, and where do you see really obstacles that seem daunting to you as you think about your own mission? And obviously, this is in the context of the mission itself, which you'll have to also describe. What is it that you're up to? I think each of the four folks that we've invited to get this conversation started, I want to turn to people in the audience quickly, are practitioners in this way. And so I think each of them can, at various stages of development, and each of them can respond to this in that way. So why don't you just introduce yourselves, in effect, as to what you're doing, because that'll be a better way than my doing it to explain what it is you do in this field.
All right, starting with the ladies. My name is Tracy Van Slyke. I'm the director of an organization called the Media Consortium, which is a very vague term, but what it is a network of over 40 of the leading progressive independent media outlets in the country. And this is ranging from The Nation, Mother Jones, Air America, Talking Points, Memo, Washington Monthly, American Prospect, so forth and so forth. And this network came together because we recognized, as journalism organizations, we had to resituate ourselves for a 21st century in terms of audience, journalism models, business models, and editorial models. And I used to run a nonprofit magazine as well called In These Times. So like Paul Glastris, I understand the pains that goes with that. I would say over the last couple of years, nonprofits have during this economic crisis particularly, didn't experience sort of the same immediate drop that the newspaper industry did, because nonprofits do have sort of a more diversified revenue source. It comes from individual donors, foundations. Advertising makes up a bulk, but not a majority of the total budget. Some had subscriptions. But I would say that they are going to start feeling the pain very quickly, if not already, because foundations, which make up a large majority of the budget, have had to cut back significantly on what they're contributing to media outlets, if not outright altogether. So that's a major issue coming down the pipeline for people. I would also say that the idea of newspapers going nonprofit, like I find that actually a fairly untenable idea on a mass scale. What I do think needs to be done, whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit, but specifically for nonprofits, is there has to be a shift in understanding about the role and impact of nonprofit media outlets, of independent media. Right now, we sort of continue to use this corporate media model of looking at what is the impact and value of independent media, which rests on sort of what is your audience size and what is your advertising range. So that makes, if you've got a big audience and you've got a big advertising budget, then you are more valuable as a media entity than maybe someone that is smaller. And we really need to shift that, both for investors who want to invest in media, as well as among funders and individual donors. There's a social mission. We need to get back to what is a social mission of media and really see how media outlets are accomplishing that social mission versus what their advertising dollar is going to be. I think that's really, really important. Just to talk a little bit, I would say that the Media Consortium came together because we recognized this was an issue, and we've done some things that I think are potentially models for other media outlets. And this is really about a change in the media practitioner's mindset that collaboration is much better than competition. We can no longer afford to work in our siloed sort of branded media outlets. We've got to start figuring out how to work together. So with the consortium, a lot of our members pooled in all their data, their subscriber lists, their email lists, and we were able to get a composite understanding of geographically and demographically what is our audience across the country. And it was like about 4 million total unique subscribers, viewers, what have you, out of 16 media outlets. And that wasn't even like counting the people, it's just checking your website on a daily basis. That was a pretty significant number to understand for independent media, and something really important to tell advertisers and funders, like, we're bigger than you think. We also helped foster an ad network we did a bunch of research for our nonprofit media outlets to come together and figure out how to develop an ad network where they work together and bring in advertising collectively versus trying to go after it individually. And we've been doing a lot of editorial marketing experiments in the sort of new media, social media world, which I can talk about. So I just want to end with the thought that the collaboration, I think, is really, really important, and that's the collaboration with users. I'd like to call them users instead of audience members or readers, is really important, but collaboration among media outlets is going to be huge, specifically for funders as well, who are going to be looking for a bigger bang for their buck versus just going after individual outlets.
That was excellent. I want to come back to some of the specifics of the collaboration that you talked about. John, I know that you're still in development with your own project in Texas, but again, to the extent that you feel comfortable, these are people who have run newsroom budgets. They know the scale of things. You've been thinking about this in practical terms. If you can give us a sense of the plan, what actually, if the plan was fully, if it materialized, what would it actually produce by the way of journalism at the state level in Texas?
In the spirit of Texan self-promotion, my pet project is something that has the working name of the Texas Tribune. This will be the first statewide online nonprofit newspaper. It's tough to talk about a newspaper when there's no paper involved. News brand. We've got to come up with some other word for it. But the idea is that we would be live, hopefully, and I think somewhat optimistically, to cover the March gubernatorial primary in Texas, which probably will determine our next governor if we haven't seceded by then, and if we do, then it will be a national newspaper, and I'll be Secretary of the Navy. But the idea is to have 12 or 13 journalists up and running, and to really be, by kind of 2011, our goal is to be to Texas public affairs, and particularly government and policy, what Politico was to the kind of 2008 election, a very credible go-to source for Texas policy. There's a lot of, it's been a funny road on the way to the, funny things have happened on the way to the forum, but we're we are making good progress. The good news is we've raised a little over $2 million against a $4 million startup goal. That's the good news. The bad news is $1 million of that is mine. And so we've got a ways to go. I would say, Steve, to your earlier point, I am just in the last couple or 3 months finding great receptivity among foundations and individuals to this idea, because it's just it's really, really needed. Let me just give you a little bit of context for how we got here. I have a day job as a technology venture capitalist, and in 2006 we began to explore, we the firm, with our 20 MBAs and 150 IQ points in very ambitious ways, began to try to explore how to profit from the demise of newspapers. And the conclusion that we came to as a firm was that the news business was just a wretched business, and it would continue so essentially in perpetuity. The sort of addendum that I added to that is, as I started to think about serious journalism, was that, okay, news is a wretched business, but in the environment of content ubiquity, which I think the barn door has opened on and will never close, serious business principles are really terrible for serious journalism. And so it's kind of that disconnect that led us to go down this road as a nonprofit paper. The bet we're making is that serious journalism, what I call capital J journalism, is a public good, capital P, capital G, and what we learned in our first semester of economics is a public good is something that the market will not produce in sufficient quantities. And so people who say to me, there's a lot of stuff going on and there's innovation, there's social networks, the market will figure this out. I call them pony theorists, as in if it looks like a big pile of horse poo and it smells like a big pile of horse poo, there must be a pony in there somewhere. The bet we're making is that is in the case of serious journalism, that's not true. We have made a very serious bet at the firm level and at the Tribune level that charging for content on the web will not work, will never work. And I know that's controversial. The question I always ask to people who disagree with that, I ask a couple. One is, what business can you reference in history which saved itself by raising prices? Doesn't exist. And the second is, if you're in a business where a 14-year-old with broadband access and too much time on his or her hands can put you out of business not because he hates your product, but because he really likes it, isn't it probably time to get another line of work? And that's what people who are putting themselves in the line of fire of paid content, I think, are doing. On the advertising side, again, our firm and our conclusion at the Tribune is that online advertising is going to be one of the great failed experiments of our time. That puts newspapers in a particularly difficult spot because they're reliant on display advertising, which is never, ever as cost-effective as paid search. Lead generation, cost per click, cost per action advertising is always more effective than paid search, but only successful when the user is transacting or is searching to transact, and so again puts newspapers in a very difficult spot. And the final thing that I would just say is that the internet never interviewed a source. The internet never filed a story. Neither did a social network. And so what our team is pretty strident about is that we need to provide a mechanism, or at least the model of a mechanism, where there is a self-sustaining NPR-like model for news in Texas, where there really can be a career path for journalism. And I'll just leave you with the thought of, and I don't believe that nonprofit journalism is the answer to everything, certainly, but I married a ballerina, and so a lot of my philanthropy is not optional in terms of where it's gone. And so I know more about dance philanthropy than, maybe not than anybody in the room, but than a lot. And I will tell you that the aggregate giving in 2008 to dance organizations, that's ballet, modern dance, tap, jazz, you name it, is about $20 million, and that's in Texas. And so that's individual giving, corporate giving, and foundations. And I just ask myself, if we really were to reorient the giving priorities of private philanthropy and open a $20 million newsroom in Texas, electronic newsroom in Texas, we would change journalism in Texas. There's no doubt about that. We'd have 15 reporters on the border of the 13th largest economy that is a failed state that all of the traditional media outlets have had to take their reporters off of. So it is not the only answer, but I think properly channeled, a really powerful one.
All right, another excellent presentation, Jeff. Now I know you're already up and running in a similar project at the monthly, and again, I just encourage you as you fashion your remarks to take us as far into your confidence as you can about what you inherited and how you thought about building it out, because you've got it back on its feet. But I know that was a hard-won process.
Thank you. And I first wanted to say and declare my non-conflict of interest. I'm not a journalist. I haven't been professionally at all, but I am sort of the Forrest Gump of journalism as I was thinking about it, because my housemaster at Harvard was Marty Peretz. My freshman roommate was Nick Lemon. Mike Kinsley crashed my wedding. Jim Fallows is an old friend. Catherine Van Hoovel was an undergraduate in the politics department at Princeton when I was a graduate student. E.J. Dionne was my tutor at the Crimson. Fred Hyatt was our editorial chairman when I was managing editor. And Jim Cramer was Jim Cramer, not a journalist, sorry about that. So I have this vicarious involvement with the kernel of what journalism is about to me, which is young people getting this enthusiasm and a public spirit, a public-oriented spirit to generate truth and knowledge and so on. And that's the most important driver in my activities, actually. We all go back to our roots in a way. Because more and more over the years I've been involved in business and therefore looking at things from a business perspective, even though I didn't go to business school, and now looking at them from a philanthropic perspective. And to think about what I would support with my philanthropic dollars, I need to comment a little bit about some of the themes I heard today, although I can't even begin to scratch the surface. First of all, I think there are two real problems that we were talking about in that first panel. One is there's a business model that's dead or at least dying or not working. And I think Ben Cardin's idea is a great one, but it won't solve the problem of big city newspapers. It could help a lot at the community level where there's a community wheel, a willingness to support and so on. To take from, since in journalism we're often not supposed to be, but we are highly ideological, especially in the city, and to take that to a business concept and why that business model is dead. I think from a business sense, if you think about balance sheets, the problem with the journalism or newspaper model is there's nothing right on the left anymore. The revenue base is gone, but there's nothing left on the right. And we in this town, I think, see that one pretty clearly. The profits are gone in this model. But we have to be careful not to confuse that with the fact that the other thing we're talking about is a massive free rider problem. Content is being generated that isn't being paid for. And that's interesting because that says to me we just started with the wrong business model from the content perspective. We have a sports franchise model. If you're Jim Brown and you're a great, or Wilt Chamberlain and you're a great sports player, you have to play with this franchise. If you're Tom Friedman, you have to write for the New York Times. Imagine if you had to hear U2 only by listening to WNBC radio station in New York. The content providers are owned, in effect, by business models that are failing. And if those content providers were all together as a cooperative or a group charging for their services, and then everybody would have to. The Google who gets advertising because they disseminate the content of all the people, and that particularly goes to how those who aren't the stars, the Tom Friedmans and so on in the industry, could be paid. I don't think we'll ever get there because you can't just flip it all of a sudden. But there is one model that to me is very interesting because I spent 6 years on the board of directors of the National Cooperative Bank. It's chartered by Congress. It's actually a private enterprise. It's the only government-supported bank that makes money in spite of the Freddie and Fannie tragedies and so on. And the cooperative bank, the co-op as an entity, is specifically gets around antitrust issues and everything else, because groups can come together for things like purchasing, selling their wares, and so on. So there could be an intellectual property type cooperative that could actually charge in a more general sense into these other outlets. In effect, we have to divorce the generators of content from the transmitters of content in the future. So I asked myself, in that big context, what in all of this is interest in the public interest to protect? Because people have talked about, oh, it's so terrible, these journalists aren't getting paid, they're not getting, well, and so we should set up a national corporation like the NEA that supports journalists. Well, yeah, maybe, but what is the public interest? Just like we have to always argue this issue of what is art and what is, in the case of the NEA. And I think, first of all, supporting newspapers or the media themselves to support content and things that are important for our democracy, like investigative reporting, is a very inefficient way. It's like my kids are always asked to sell popcorn for their schools, and I don't do that anymore. I give the school a check. I give them a straight check because they get 10 cents on the dollar for the popcorn they sell. And anyway, I don't have the time to go out and sell popcorn in my office all the time. So what do I want to support? So I'm looking as a business guy, looking charitably. I'm looking at things that are important to the public and things that I personally have an involvement in and want to support. When my wife and I sat down and we decided to focus some of our charitable giving in the area of media and so on. And we looked at, first of all, we're from the D.C. area. We both grew up in this area. I was born about 3 blocks from here. It's George Washington Hospital. And Washington has some unique characteristics as a capital city, but also, frankly and honestly, when I was a kid, it was a parochial southern town, and it's got a lot of the overlay still today, where we live and so on, of that. So we decided to focus in the Washington, D.C. area, but not in a narrow sense of individual communities. What we wanted and what we liked the idea of supporting were unaligned platforms with non-ideological, specifically missions, a commitment to good public policy, to opening up the print and the airwaves, and diversity, the promotion of diverse viewpoints. The young lady who raised the female issue today, actually it's interesting because one of the groups we supported to go to the punchline is WPFW Radio here in Washington, D.C. It's one of the Pacifica stations. And my son does the 2K Nation program there, which is high school students produce it. And last week on the way home, as I was driving him home, he and his friend were saying, we got to get some more girls. We got to get girls. The program would be so much different if we just, it had nothing to do with, they don't know diversity like we know it as a quota or anything. He was saying, this program would be so much better with greater diversity. So we wanted to find local media that were really aligned with that mission. So Washington Monthly, first of all, WPFW came up to us because those of you who know Washington know it is Washington. It's about jazz. They call themselves Jazz and Justice Radio. I hate some of the content on that station. I listen to these guys saying, if you black guy, you use a hair cream and the white guy's just trying to imprison you, and but they allow people to come on the air and promote talk about diverse viewpoints that are rampant in the community. So although I don't support all the content, I like the fact that it's open airwaves. They don't screen, they support diversity. And the two cultural things, jazz and blues, are so unique to this community in Washington, D.C. On the Washington Monthly side, half those names I just listed earlier cut their teeth journalistically with Charlie Peters. Washington Monthly has been an institution in this city and across the country for those who are in the middle of politics in any case. But one of the really great things about it is they've always hired young journalists, let them run free. How many of them of the great journalists of today, particularly print journalists, but also other media, have cut their teeth at the Monthly? That says to me it's an open, vibrant institution. It's not looking for stars. It's not trying to sell itself by the star of the moment, but rather it's pursuing great public policy and so on. It's a training ground. The specific mandate is not this ideology or that. You can never tell a Washington Monthly article by saying, oh, this is the topic. I can tell you that labor or the right supports this, so this will be what the article says. So our focus was to stimulate a revival of the monthly. I think Charlie Peters said it very eloquently because we provided the support in the form of a challenge grant really before the election. But Charlie said, no matter what the outcome of this election, this was last year, is we're going to re-enter an era in Washington and in this country where public policy matters. And in order to do that, you need to have what Paul Glasters was saying. You need to have people who go into the bureaucracy and what's going on at the FDA in a deep kind of analytical way. So that was our commitment to try to support that type of institution.
Great, thank you very much. So we've talked about a kind of a national network associated with nonprofit media that's up and running with an audience of 4 million. We've talked about Texas. We've talked about Washington. And Mark, you're coming to us from Sacramento, and in addition to talking about your own development work there, I hope you can give us a kind of a quick sweep of the landscape about how philanthropy and foundations are responding to the loss of journalism in California. Because Doug in the first panel asked the question, what's the most endangered species? And I think there's, you could certainly argue that journalism at City Hall, journalism at the zoning board, journalism at the school board is one very important endangered species. But I think there's equally a compelling consensus that at the state capitol, the disappearance of ordinary independent reporting is also terribly important. Just very briefly at this hearing, Senator McCaskill came in and talked about her life as a public prosecutor in Missouri and said that what she noticed, what made her office click was the belief that there were 2 or 3 reporters who would find out if something serious went wrong, and that discipline was critical to the culture of the prosecutor's office that she oversaw. And the loss of that in a state like California, given its indigenous crisis of governance, would seem very powerful. So what's actually happening now? There are some new initiatives that are flying, as well as the work that you're going to describe on your own back.
Yeah, I'm Mark Paul, and I'm Deputy Director of the New America Foundation program in California. And like John, we're involved in trying to create an online way of delivering journalism about California that we call California Next. New America, we've come at this sort of from the opposite direction of John. They looked at it as potentially a profit opportunity and saw nonprofit as the only way to go. We, as a nonprofit, came at it as that relied on the commercial media as in part our distribution channel for the work we do in policy, and seeing that beginning to disappear and trying to think about, well, perhaps we have a role in trying to create a platform not only for ourselves but for all the others in California who need a way to communicate, do journalism and serious policy discussion about issues. Just as Steve said, I think the coverage is perhaps the most vulnerable of all the pieces of journalism, and particularly in big states like California. I'm fairly confident that we will, over the long run, find ways to have successful models for coverage of national politics. I'm pretty confident that the newspapers will find, and news companies will find a way to maintain their very strong local franchises. But particularly in large states like California, it's very expensive to do statewide coverage, and we're already seeing that falling out in the current crisis. I mean, California is in effect disappearing from the news in its own newspapers. The Capitol bureaus in Sacramento. I mean, this is a state with 38 million people, has a budget of $100 billion. Half of the newspaper reporters covering the state capitol have disappeared in the last roughly 18 months. And prior to that, the last outside electronic journalists from commercial television and news stations left the Capitol in 1988. There is now only a single electronic reporter at the state capitol from outside the state capitol, public radio correspondent from San Francisco. But it's not only the coverage of the state capital that's disappearing. It's also the kind of sustained beat coverage that Paul talked about, which is beat coverage that really is statewide in nature in a state like California. The higher education system. In California, we have about 3 million people who are either students or employees of public colleges and universities in the state of California. As far as I can tell, there is a single reporter assigned full-time to covering higher education in California. There are only 2 reporters left covering law and the courts at the statewide level. California Supreme Court has been a pathbreaker for 40 years in law in the country. There are only 2 reporters left covering those issues. There's only 1 reporter covering labor. California is a state in which there are tens of millions of people who every morning turn on the tap and are depending on water to flow from hundreds of miles away in this desert environment. There are only 2, maybe 3 reporters covering water issues in California anymore. I mean, those are the sort of the sustained backbone parts of public knowledge about how their society works that are simply evaporating, and so that's what we're trying to replace. And I believe that that it's unlikely that the market is going to fully support that. That, as John said, there needs to be we need to think about that kind of journalistic coverage as being a public good. That we will have to look for sponsorship either from nonprofits or from our large institutions in the way that they've provided sponsorship for public broadcasting. But there's another function as well, which I think we're thinking about with California Next that needs to be provided, and that's the kind of aggregation and filtering function that we've relied on the newspapers for. I mean, a front page of a newspaper is a wonderful thing because at a glance, even if you don't read, very deep in any single story, you're given some very intelligent people's information about what they regard as the most important things that demand your attention. And as we move in an online world in which there is information coming from a lot of sources, people will still heavily perhaps find even more valuable the aggregating function that provides some filtering that helps give people the signals about what is the most important thing worthy of their attention. And that is as a role again that the world of philanthropy and nonprofits have provided. After all, our cultural institutions like museums and libraries and symphony orchestras and ballet companies, a large part of their function is to preserve and send signals to the rest of us about what is the very best in our culture.
Great, thank you. Before we turn to the audience, I just want to ask 1 or 2 specific follow-ups from the presentations to try to push my own ambition to kind of get down into the P&Ls. I guess those aren't P&Ls in a nonprofit, but anyway, John, you talked about a $4 million plan. I think you referred to a dozen or 15 reporters. But say more, if you were up and running, what would the reporters be doing? How would you define the boundaries of your content? Are you going to do sports? Or when you define the Texas Tribune to potential investors and with the journalists that you've been collaborating with in the development process, what do you know and what do you not know about what this beast would be if it succeeded?
We will also do some level of aggregation and filtering, but the sort of coin of the realm here is meant to be original reporting, and that'll happen in phases as our budget grows. And I have learned, by the way, I learned very early not to call this nonprofit journalism. It's non-taxable journalism, because we will not, unlike Minnesota Public Radio, which is a fabulously profitable enterprise. That's the idea here. The only difference between us and for-profit institutions at a high level is if we've got an extra buck, we want to put that buck back into hiring another reporter, not dividending it out to me or my Labrador. So the coverage areas, and there's still some debate. There is still some debate about the degree to which we can afford true beat reporting right out of the gate. We certainly will We will have failed if we are not thought of by the national media and Texas media as the definitive coverage of election politics and state house politics in Texas. That's that's plank one. Feeding out from that are the big statewide issues: border coverage, K through 12, higher ed, public safety, public health. If you've got a dozen reporters, what we'll likely have to do is lop off border. We will likely have to lop off public safety, and so we'll be left with K through 12 public health, role of the lobby in the Capitol, and Capitol politics, sort of as the
core
four
function.
pillars. Right.
And Tracy, a follow-up question to what you were talking about with your collaboration network. You gave a sketch of what your members receive from the collaboration and its potential sources of value. First, creating a whole greater than the sum of its parts for funders and for advertisers, and to some extent visibility across the members about the business model that they're each working with. But what do you think is the final potential of the collaborative network in nonprofit media? Is content sharing a piece of it? Do you find that these groups are just as proud and just as proprietary in their nonprofit setting as for-profit competitors are? Or is there a sense that this is only the beginning of what collaboration might produce?
Yes. There used to be, I think, a lot more competition, but over the last couple years, people recognize that's to their own detriment. They can't afford to be as competitive. Also, on the political level, as well as the business model level. And for me, I would say that I would ultimately want people to be able to collaborate on a much bigger level that brings more money into the sector, that produces much more high-impact journalism. I think we need to be really focusing on how we can situate ourselves in this new media environment to really best take advantage of new opportunities like citizen journalism and community crowdsourcing and so forth, and really need to be investing in a lot of incubation and R&D around those levels. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So for me, I really feel like foundations actually need to be really supporting a lot of this incubation and R&D at this point, as well as the individual journalism outlets.
Great. I want to get you people out more or less on advertised time, so let's turn to audience questions and take a few. Anybody have one for the panel? Yes, first with the paper in the air there. It might be a reporter's notebook.
Yes. I'm George Blueston from AARP Publications. For the efforts in California and Texas, do you have a strategy for bringing an audience to what you do, for promoting and marketing it?
Yeah, I mean, we're a technology startup, essentially. And so we've got a launch budget, a launch plan, a syndication budget, a syndication plan. And it's kind of the $64,000 question, right, is how do you build a brand that attracts readers from scratch? And it certainly ain't easy. And that also brings into question, how do you measure your success for your supporters? One of the things that we believe quite passionately, and we've had some validation from foundations, is that as long as we're pretty agnostic about where you read our stuff, in other words, if we do a K through 12 story and you read it in hard copy in the Brazoria Daily News, and we've syndicated that to the Brazoria paper for a fraction of what AP would have, that's all goodness. And foundations think that is goodness as well. And so it is a startup, and it is the thing that worries me most, is just how do you build a brand from scratch that has both, serious gravitas and real reach.
Are you saying you're giving away the content?
Oh yeah.
Good. Gary.
Thanks. Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. I was thinking about I think I got sort of the flavor of Steve's opening comments at the beginning of this session, not this panel, about how we talk about this subject and this issue and how to frame it and, to define what's in the public interest. And I was thinking, as I've been listening through the two panels, it's an interesting question, what we call this business. It's what to use old business school terms. What is the core business that we're talking about? The subject that's a little more interesting to me, and I wonder if I could just throw out a couple of thoughts and get your reaction to it, is sort of what are the core competencies in this business? So as I've been listening to the two panels, I started to make some notes, and I was thinking, well, whatever we call this business, one of the competencies that we want is the capacity for we want an investigative capacity. We want a in-depth category knowledge capacity. We want a sources capacity. We want an enterprise reporting capacity. And we want shoe leather versus web surfing capacity. So let me just stop there and just see if I can get some reactions.
Sounds like a newspaper. How do you build that capacity in buckets that are, 1 million, 2 million big at least incubation stage? Jeff, why don't you take a pass at that since you've been working on this?
Well, I think the two models in California and Texas are one. You build an infrastructure that can be supported through a different business model or revenue model. Somebody else pays for it rather than just your advertisers and those whom you can get to subscribe. In the case of, say, the Washington Monthly, it's more about building an institution which is dedicated to certain principles and then inviting or having, in this case, because Washington Monthly runs on a very frugal budget, and the way it does is because it trains young people in a mode of public policy journalism, oriented journalism that is engaging to them but also builds their careers. And Washington Monthly, more than having stars who are stars at the time they're at the Monthly, benefits from this legacy of having had people who went on to much greater careers. It's like great teachers or great coaches who go from your high school go on to coach UCLA basketball or something. So that to me, and that's what I was trying to support, all the things you're talking about, but not through any single individuals, but rather through an institution. The challenge in that case is Washington Monthly is, let's face it, it is extreme. The budget for Washington Monthly and that it runs on now, and Diane is smiling here, it has to increase over time as we build philanthropy into it and more advertisers, but it's very small. It's very tough for anybody who writes for this one publication to make a living. So in my mind, and actually I don't know how public this is, but the general affiliation with New America Foundation is one example of where I think these kinds of outlets need to have a broader affiliation with like-minded institutions whose mission is to generate broader, longer-term analyses of public policy trends and so on. And then they have an interactive relationship where no one individual is sitting there saying, I can't live unless you pay me $70,000 to sit here in the Washington Monthly in front of a computer screen and write stories.
I would add one more competency, and this is for the environment we are in now, and that's the engagement competency, where you are going to Don Tapscott, who wrote Wikinomics, said that publishers can no longer just be publishers, they have to be community builders. And you're going to have to really figure out what that means, what your community means for your organization. But it could have a real impact on how you produce journalism, how your users are involved in that creation of that journalism, the dissemination of that journalism, and the support of that journalism. And that needs to be really thought about, not just comments on an article, but how are you bringing them into the process, because that's the environment we're working in now. You can't go back into the one-way broadcast, I'm talking at you model. It's not going to work.
So, but Tracy, when you, as an orchestrator of the competencies that constitute a whole greater than the sum of your network's parts, when you interact with advertisers or philanthropists or foundations, is it about these competencies? Is that what defines the value of the network, or is it about something else, the audiences or the politics, the ideology?
D, all of the above. It's about the politics. It's about, progressive media. There's a lot of conversation, for example, how the mainstream media failed during this, in the lead up to the economic crisis. The progressive media was there pounding the pavement, doing the reporting years before all of this. So how do we actually support getting that journalism out to have broader impact in the world is, part of the argument I make.
Next question. Behind, in the back there with the white shirt sleeve collar.
Oh, mine? Okay. Hi, I'm Victor Ricard with Free Press. I was wondering if the panelists could discuss a little bit more in depth about the potential for public policy to assist or enable nonprofit institutions of the press. We've talked a little bit about, giving more money to public media, but I was wondering if there are any other policies you might consider.
I obviously have views about that, but any of you? No. Well, good.
Well, the notion that I frankly really don't like is this idea of whatever they call it, low profit. What's the enterprise?
I've heard that.
FC3. So
LC3.
the LC3, and so I'd
What
like
is
to,
that? Can you define that? What is it?
It's horrible. It's confused. But there
Is it a provision of the tax law, or what is it?
There would be some provision in the tax law that makes room for these sort of hybrid beasts that aren't supposed to make too much money, kind of.
So these are not entities that exist now in the tax code.
It's a subsidy.
Victor just wrote a report about this. Do you want to
So,
explain
Victor,
it
can
real
you
quickly?
answer the question? What is a low profit what is a low profit entity, and how does it exist in policy?
Low profit limited liability corporation or company. So L3C, and actually does exist in several states. So any company could become licensed under an L3C.
And so the idea is to make that a part of the IRS code. I mean, that's part of the movement.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, it's already in
So
state laws.
what are its defining characteristics?
Well, it would cap profits, but it would be low profit. So anyone could invest in it, but they have to primarily serve a public good as their mandate, and it would encourage civil society groups to buy and control newspapers.
And what I always say is, I'd love to be at that first board meeting, right? I mean, who?
So it's a kind of utility concept that with a marketplace function around it, I guess, something like that. Interesting. Okay, woman there.
Linda Woodstock from Capital News Connection. I'm just curious, in public radio and how that works. There's the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds. It's a private foundation. It gets its money obviously from Congress, but Congress doesn't have any say over how that money's spent. Capital News Connection was launched with a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It helps to sustain stations. All these different entities. Is there some sort of room for that? I mean, one of the things that CPB struggles with, I think, is that there's public television on one side, public radio on another, and now the web, and all these different categories are breaking down because essentially all of us have to serve all media. We're all walking around with three different appendages. So is there some other, for our cameras and our video cameras and our microphones and our notepads, and increasingly that's happening. So is there some sort of entity perhaps that's similar to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that could be formed? Just a thought.
Well, can I go ahead, Mark?
I think we don't know what the end state of this transition looks like, if in fact there is one. But I think that before we get to making that kind of decision, we need to know what is going to fall out. Like Alex, I'm more confident that newspapers will and companies will find a way to stabilize themselves and their operations. After all, most newspapers in the United States made money last year. It's their parent companies that are in trouble because of all the debt they took on unwisely. For instance, my old company where I worked, McClatchy, was profitable last year. All the individual McClatchy papers are still profitable, but until they get rid of the overhang of debt, it can't work out. But we just don't know what is going to fall out. And before I get to the point where I say, the government needs to subsidize directly some sort of level of coverage, we need to know, what it is exactly. Whether there's some crucial thing that either the nonprofit sector or the profit sector won't provide.
Yeah, can I just comment? I don't think it's a problem of print going away. And many of the old business models are going away. If U.S. News and World Report is demised as the third grade publication, what about this? The Week. This thing is close to 1 million in circulation now. It's growing, the most rapid publication in America. It's profitable. The British group just roared in here, created it, and probably will overtake Time and/or Newsweek in the future. The problem is they're the free rider on the content. They're taking everybody's content, but people are buying and subscribing to this. Or here in Washington, Politico, Roll Call, there's a number of groups that support a whole staff of people to do investigative reporting and so on cover politics. And so those things aren't going away. What's changing is the economics of the general journalism that we think of as protecting American democracy.
Okay, can I just answer the question directly myself, and Tracy, if you want to jump in? I do think that we have a public media infrastructure in this country that is relevant in this transition, and that ought to be taken into account, and not just as received. Because while your experience of CPB might have been arm's length as the recipient of a grant, I don't think most observers of CPB would say that it's been as insulated from political influence as that should have been. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity to solve that problem or to attempt reform. This is an environment, the transition is so rapid, this is just my perspective, but the transition is so rapid and so all-encompassing that anybody who has a footprint and a devotion to the public good, however you want to define it, I think these folks have surrounded it pretty well, has an opportunity to be felt in the next iteration of journalism. And if you accept that proposition broadly, then you have to observe we have this enormous infrastructure of public broadcasting that has been inert in this country for a generation because the for-profit media environment was so robust. So what would reform look like? What would, not just accepting the extant television focus or radio focus of some of this infrastructure, but pushing them into new media, into engagement strategies. I mean, that's the challenge for policy, I think, and also to ensure that you end up with an institution or a network of institutions that is as protected from politics as quite a lot of other civil service institutions in this country are, at the insistence of the way our system works. It's only because the media is the CPB has been so weak that it's been pushed around the way it has been, I think, in my view. So. I'm not talking about CPB leadership or anything like that. I'm just saying structurally, it's been in a very weak position. So I know, Victor, you've got a piece out. I haven't had a chance to read it. It landed in my inbox yesterday, but I commend it. It's a very thoughtful, serious review of one portion of these issues. What's the web address that you could read this? freepress.net, they have a big piece out that touches upon a lot of these. Tracy, did you want to say something?
Well, a couple things. One, the report is one of the most comprehensive sort of pulling together of a lot of different business model options for news that people should look at. Two, I think one of their recommendations, there has to be a lot more investment into public media, but also redefining what is public media is really important, and that includes low-power FM, that includes online sites, what have you. And I would thirdly add, Jessica Clark, who's right here, is one of the leading experts in public media and what it's been doing. And if you've got questions around that, she just put out a report, too, called Public Media 2.0 that's talking about the future of public media and what needs to happen. So,
did you want to ask a question, Jessica, or did you want to?
I just wanted to comment that there's discussions happening around CPB at the CPB level and above and below about perhaps changing it to a corporation for public media, expanding its mandate. but even that's a political issue, and it'll take a lot of doing to make that happen. But even if you look at the appropriation right now, there's latitude for funding other kinds of projects, not necessarily print, because it's about electronic communication, but all kinds of projects. And even more quickly, there are opportunities for nonprofits and for-profits to collaborate, to create hybrid news projects. That's part of what the consortium has made possible, is to bring people into the room who might not normally think of one another as allies, or working together because their structures are so different, and to allow them to create new projects that are web native and that really can work in the new environment in a different way.
It's 11:40, 10 minutes after closing. You've been very patient and very constructive and helpful. Please join me in thanking the panel for their terrific presentation.
Good luck.
Thank you for being here. We hope we'll see you back here at our next discussion. Thanks, Tracy.
No, thank you.